Here is something most people covering this conflict are not talking about, and I think that is a mistake. While every camera in the region has been pointed at bunker buster bombs and burning tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, the United States has quietly been finishing work on a weapon that does not look like a weapon at all. It looks like a fighter jet that shrank in the wash. No cockpit, no pilot, no canopy. A jet-powered aircraft that can fly into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, make its own targeting decisions in the final seconds of an engagement, and if it gets shot down, nobody grieves and nobody apologizes, because there was never anybody inside it to begin with. It is called the Valkyrie, and defense analysts who have spent years watching this program develop are now saying, quietly at first, and now not so quietly, that this is the aircraft that could change the entire calculus of the Iran conflict. Not because of what it has already done, because of what it has built to make possible the moment it is unleashed in this theater. And that moment may already be closer than the Pentagon wants to admit. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what this aircraft is, why it was built, why it has been quietly teamed with America's most advanced fighters for over a year, and why the specific problem Iran has created in the Strait of Hormuz is almost a textbook description of the exact scenario this drone was designed to solve. Stay with me, because the part at the end, the part about what happens when you multiply this aircraft by a number the Air Force has never officially confirmed, is the part that has genuinely alarmed people inside the defense community. Quick note on who I am before we get into it. I've spent years around military aviation, from cockpit-level operations to mission planning rooms where decisions about exactly this kind of technology get made and debated. That is the lens I am bringing to this analysis. Everything you are about to hear is drawn from confirmed program details, official statements, and reporting from outlets that specialize in tracking this exact category of weapons technology. I will be clear with you about what is confirmed, what is still developing, and where the real uncertainty sits. No hype, no speculation dressed up as fact. Let's get into it. To understand why this aircraft matters right now, in this specific conflict, you have to understand the problem the United States has been quietly wrestling with since the first strikes on Iran began. Iran's air defense network, even after weeks of American and Israeli strikes, is not simple. It is a patchwork of Russian-supplied and domestically produced systems, radar netted together across a country roughly the size of Alaska, with mobile launchers that can relocate between the moment a satellite photographs them and the moment a strike package arrives overhead. Every time a manned aircraft, an F-35, an F-15E, an F-16, crosses into that airspace, there is a human being strapped into an ejection seat, betting their life on the assumption that Iranian radar operators have not found a gap in the jamming. That is the calculation American commanders have been making every single night of this air campaign. Send the pilot in, accept the risk, or do not strike the target at all. Let me be specific about exactly what that Iranian air defense picture looks like, because the specifics matter here. Iran's network is built around a mix of Russian-supplied S-300 long-range surface-to-air systems, domestically produced systems like the Bavar 373, and a dense layer of shorter-range mobile missile batteries designed specifically to survive an opening night of strikes by relocating constantly and hiding among civilian infrastructure. Weeks of American and Israeli strikes have degraded significant parts of this network. But degrading a mobile, dispersed air defense system is fundamentally different from eliminating it. The same lesson that is applied to Iran's Mosquito fleet of fast attack boats hiding in coastal sea caves. As long as any part of that network survives and stays capable of finding and engaging aircraft, every additional sortie into that airspace carries risk for the human being in the cockpit. That is the exact condition the aircraft in this story was purpose-built to change. The entire premise of the aircraft you are about to learn about is that this calculation should no longer have to include the words betting their life. It is called an attritable aircraft, a term the Air Force Research Laboratory coined specifically for this category of unmanned combat drone. Attritable does not mean disposable, and it does not mean cheap in the sense of flimsy. It means built to a cost point low enough that commanders can afford to risk it in the most dangerous airspace on the planet without a five-star general having to sign off on losing a $100 million aircraft, and, more importantly, without anyone having to make a phone call to a family. The program is called the Valkyrie, designation XQ-58A, built by Kratos Defense and Security Solutions in partnership with the Air Force Research Laboratory. And here's the detail that should stop you for a second. This aircraft went from contract award to first flight in under 2.5 years. For comparison, traditional fighter programs take a decade or more to reach that milestone. Kratos built the Valkyrie using commercial manufacturing processes and modern design software specifically to compress that timeline, because the entire strategic logic behind this aircraft depends on being able to build it fast, cheap, and in large numbers. This idea did not appear out of nowhere. The attritable aircraft concept traces back to an Air Force research laboratory effort called Skyborg, launched specifically to answer a question that had been quietly haunting Pentagon planners since the early 2010s. What happens to American air superiority the day an adversary fields air defense and electronic warfare systems dense enough that flying a $50, $60, or $80 million manned fighter into that airspace becomes too costly to sustain over a long campaign? Skyborg was never meant to replace the fighter pilot. It was meant to give the fighter pilot an expendable escort, something that could fly directly into the teeth of the threat, soak up the first wave of missiles, and report back exactly where the danger was hiding, all without a human life riding on the outcome. The Valkyrie became the physical proof that this idea could actually fly, and fly cheaply enough to matter. Here is what the Valkyrie can actually do, and I want to walk through this carefully because the specifics are what make this alarming rather than just interesting. It launches without a runway, using a rocket-assisted takeoff system from a static launcher, meaning it can be fielded from expeditionary locations, remote airstrips, even improvised sites without the 8,000 or 9,000 feet of paved runway a traditional fighter requires. At the end of its mission, it comes down under a parachute, meaning the launch and recovery footprint for this aircraft is a fraction of what any conventional combat jet needs. That single detail, runway independence, is enormous in a theater like the Persian Gulf, where America's traditional air bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and across the region are known, mapped, and sitting inside range of Iranian ballistic missiles and drones that have already struck U.S. positions multiple times in this conflict. An aircraft that does not need those bases changes the entire vulnerability equation for American air power in this fight. Now here is the part that has moved this from an interesting engineering story to something the defense community is watching with real unease. The Valkyrie is not being developed as a standalone weapon. It is being developed as a teammate. The U.S. Marine Corps and Air Force have spent the past 2 years running an escalating series of test flights pairing the Valkyrie with America's most capable manned fighters. It has flown alongside the F-35B stealth fighter in electronic attack and suppression of enemy air defense testing. It has flown in coordinated formation with F-15E Strike Eagles and F-16C Fighting Falcons, with the manned aircraft directing the drone using Link 16, the same secure tactical data network that already ties together the entire American and Allied air picture in the Gulf. Think about what that actually means operationally. A single F-35 pilot, sitting safely behind the aircraft's own sensor and stealth advantage, can now push 3, 4, 5 Valkyries ahead of them into the most dangerous part of the sky. The drones absorb the radar contacts. The drones draw the missile launches. The drones can carry a sensor package to map the enemy's air defense picture in real time, or in later configurations, carry actual weapons, including reports of integration work exploring AIM-120 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles slung under the wings. The manned pilot stays alive. The mission still gets done, and if an Iranian surface-to-air missile battery fires on a Valkyrie instead of an F-35, that is not a tragedy. That is the system working exactly as designed. Let's talk about the math for a second, because this is the part that turns an interesting engineering story into something that genuinely worries people who think about air campaigns for a living. Trade reporting on the program has consistently framed the entire value proposition of the Valkyrie around cost. A single F-35A carries a price tag north of $80 million, and that number does not include the years of pilot training, the support infrastructure, or the political cost of losing one in a contested strike. An attritable jet, like the Valkyrie, is built to a small fraction of that cost, specifically so that a commander can look at a mission with real risk of loss and make a completely different decision than they would with a manned aircraft. Now multiply that logic. If a single F-35 pilot can command a formation of 4 or 5 Valkyries over a secure Link 16 network, one manned sortie effectively becomes a 5 or 6 aircraft strike package with only one human life anywhere near the threat envelope. Send that same formation against Iran's mobile air defense batteries, the ones that have to relocate constantly to survive, and you're no longer asking a pilot to personally hunt a moving target in contested airspace. You are asking a swarm of expendable jet-powered decoys and sensors to find it, fix it, and only then bring a human-guided or autonomously guided weapon to bear. That is the scenario that has people inside the defense community using words like alarming, not because the technology is exotic, but because the math finally works. I need to ask something of you before we go further into this, because this is exactly the kind of story that gets buried under louder headlines about missile strikes and blockade enforcement. If you want the layered, sourced breakdown of the technology that is actually going to shape how this conflict plays out in its next phase, subscribe and turn on notifications now. This program is moving fast, and I am tracking every credible development on it as it happens. Now, let's talk about the part of this story that I think most people watching the news have completely missed, and it is the part that explains why some analysts are using words like alarming, and why some inside the defense community are reportedly uneasy about how quickly this capability could be pushed into an active shooting war. The U.S. Air Force actually ran its own competition to select its next generation of unmanned loyal wingman aircraft, the program formerly called Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA. 2 designs were chosen to move forward into that program: the General Atomics YFQ-42A and the Anduril Industries YFQ-44A. The Valkyrie itself was not selected in that first round, but here is what almost nobody outside the trade press understood correctly when that decision was announced. The Air Force did not walk away from the Valkyrie. It kept using it aggressively as the live test bed for the exact concept of operations the entire Collaborative Combat Aircraft program depends on: how a human pilot commands a flight of autonomous jets in real combat conditions. Earlier this year, the Air Force successfully demonstrated an F-15E and an F-16C, each controlling a multi-ship flight of Valkyries simultaneously. Multiple autonomous jets, 1 human, live control. That is not a research paper. That is a demonstrated capability sitting in the American arsenal right now, in a year where American pilots are flying real combat sorties against Iranian air defenses every single week. And there is a deeper layer to this that deserves its own moment, because it goes to the same unsettled question that came up when sea drones from a different program struck an Iranian naval base for the first time in this conflict. The Air Force Research Laboratory has been developing and training artificial intelligence algorithms specifically for the Valkyrie's autonomous air combat operations, using neural networks that fly the aircraft against simulated opponents with simulated mission systems and mock weapons. In plain language, this aircraft has been training itself in simulation to fight air-to-air engagements without a human at the controls. The Marine Corps has separately been developing variants of this same airframe with landing gear for runway operations, and has expressed serious interest in short takeoff, vertical landing variants that would let these drones operate from amphibious ships, forward expeditionary sites, even damaged runways, anywhere the traditional multi-thousand-foot paved strip is not available. Kratos, the manufacturer, has already begun serial production ahead of any confirmed large order, building an initial batch of more than 20 aircraft specifically so that when a customer signs a contract, jets are sitting on the factory floor ready to fly, not years away on a production schedule. Trade press covering the program has reported that the company could have somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 aircraft ready for immediate delivery the moment a firm order lands. A highly unusual position for any defense manufacturer to take before a contract is signed. That is not a company hedging a bet. That is a company that believes demand for this capability is coming fast and coming from a real operational need, not a future budget line item. The Marine Corps, separately, has been just as aggressive, running at least 4 confirmed test flights, developing landing gear variants for conventional runway operations, and openly stating interest in short takeoff, vertical landing versions that could fly from amphibious ships steaming in the Gulf right now, not future bases years from being built. Now, let's bring this back to the specific conflict everyone is watching, because this is where the theory turns into something with real teeth. Iran's entire air defense and maritime harassment strategy in this war has depended on one core assumption: that American commanders will not risk manned pilots and billion-dollar stealth aircraft flying repeated sorties into contested airspace to chase every mobile radar, every hidden missile battery, every fast attack boat hiding in a sea cave along the southern coast. That assumption has held up reasonably well so far, which is exactly why the Mosquito fleet, why the coastal missile batteries on islands like Greater Tunb and Abu Musa, why the drone and ballistic missile barrages toward American bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan have all continued despite weeks of American strikes. Iran is betting on American risk aversion. An aircraft like the Valkyrie is a direct answer to that bet. If commanders can send a formation of expendable jet-powered, sensor-carrying, potentially weapon-carrying drones ahead of every manned strike package, the entire risk calculation that has been shaping the pace of this air campaign changes. Sorties that would have been judged too risky for a manned aircraft become viable because the aircraft absorbing the risk was never going to come home to a family regardless of the outcome. Here is the hard truth, though, and I think this is the part that separates a serious analysis from breathless hype. The Valkyrie has not been publicly confirmed as deployed into this specific theater, and the Pentagon has not announced its operational use in strikes against Iran. What we know, from confirmed program details and reporting, is a capability that exists, has been extensively tested with exactly the aircraft flying missions over Iran right now, and matches almost perfectly the operational problem this specific war has created. That is a meaningfully different claim than saying it has already been used, and I want to be precise about that distinction, because too much coverage of this conflict blurs confirmed fact with plausible speculation. What is genuinely alarming to people who track this closely is not a specific strike that has already happened. It is the fact that the gap between what this aircraft can do and what this specific war needs has almost completely closed, at a moment when the war shows no sign of ending. There's also a precedent sitting right in front of everyone in this exact conflict that most coverage has failed to connect to the Valkyrie story, and I think that is a mistake. Israel has leaned heavily on loitering munitions and smaller autonomous strike drones throughout its own campaign against Iranian targets, using them to hunt mobile air defense radar and command vehicles that would take a manned strike package hours to locate and confirm. That approach, cheap, expendable, autonomous, or semi-autonomous systems absorbing the riskiest part of the hunting process, is exactly the doctrine the Valkyrie was designed to scale up to a much larger, faster, jet-powered platform. What Israel has been doing with small loitering munitions over these past months is, in miniature, a preview of what a fleet of Valkyries could do at a completely different scale and a completely different speed. When you put those two things side by side, the smaller drones already proving the doctrine works in this exact theater, and a larger, faster, weapon-capable airframe sitting fully tested and ready for production order, the timeline for this technology, showing up in a more visible role in this specific war, starts to look a lot shorter than most people assume. Let's talk about why other countries are watching this so closely, because this is not just an American story. China has its own rapidly developing loyal wingman drone programs, and Chinese state defense researchers have already published extensively on exactly the kind of distributed, low-cost, high-volume drone doctrine the Valkyrie represents. Russia has watched autonomous systems reshape naval warfare in the Black Sea through Ukraine's Sea Drone campaign, and is almost certainly studying how the same logic applies in the air. Every nation that maintains contested airspace over its own territory, which includes Iran, is watching this specific aircraft's development for the same reason American commanders are excited about it, because it is the first serious, funded, flight-tested answer to the question of how a military conducts a sustained air campaign over defended territory without accepting a steady drip of pilot casualties. If the Valkyrie or aircraft like it become a standard part of how the United States prosecutes this war, it does not just change the tempo of strikes on Iran, it resets the baseline assumption every future adversary has to plan around, which is that American air power will always come with a human cost that limits how aggressively it gets used. Remove that limit, and the entire deterrence math shifts, not just for Iran, but for every future confrontation the United States finds itself weighing. That is precisely why the Air Force chose to keep two separate next-generation designs, the General Atomics YFQ-42A and the Anduril YFQ-44A. Moving through its formal collaborative combat aircraft program at the same time, it kept flying the Valkyrie as a live testbed. Nobody serious inside the Pentagon believes this is a one-aircraft story. They believe it is the opening chapter of an entire category of warfare, and the Valkyrie simply happens to be the airframe that got there first, flew first, and is sitting furthest along the production line right now, in the middle of the one conflict where every argument for using it is already true. For Iran specifically, the strategic problem this creates is layered. Every dollar and every hour spent hardening a radar site or dispersing a missile battery against manned aircraft strikes was calculated against a known variable, the willingness of the United States to risk pilots. An adversary that no longer has to weigh that variable the same way can, in theory, run a higher tempo of sorties against the same targets with a lower political and human cost per mission. That does not guarantee victory in any campaign, and it does not make Iran's mobile, dispersed defense network suddenly irrelevant. But it does mean the assumption Iranian planners have been building their entire air defense doctrine around for this war may be quietly becoming less reliable with every month this aircraft moves closer to a confirmed operational role. There is one more piece of this that I think deserves real weight, because it is the same question that came up when American sea drones struck an Iranian naval base for the first time in this war, and nobody could say for certain whether a human had authorized the final attack run or whether the autonomous system made that call on its own. The Air Force Research Laboratory has openly confirmed that Valkyrie test flights have used AI algorithms trained through neural networks to fly the aircraft against simulated opponents in mock combat, developing the aircraft's ability to make air combat decisions without a human physically at the controls. That is not a hypothetical future capability. That is documented, confirmed testing that has already happened. The unresolved question, the one that should genuinely make anyone pause, is where the line sits between a human approving a strike and a machine executing one. Once these aircraft move from simulated dogfights against mock opponents to real formations flying over real, defended Iranian airspace. Nobody outside a small circle in the Pentagon can answer that question with certainty right now. And that uncertainty is a meaningful part of why this technology is being watched so closely, not just by allies, but by ethicists and members of Congress who oversee this exact category of weapons development. Now let's bring this down to ground level, because the consequences of a shift like this reach well beyond a defense contractor's production line in Oklahoma. If autonomous attritable aircraft meaningfully increase the pace and aggressiveness of the American air campaign against Iran's coastal defenses, missile sites, and drone infrastructure, That accelerates exactly the campaign that is currently trying to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Before this conflict, roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil trade transited that strait every single day. Traffic has been reduced to a trickle for weeks. Every day that traffic stays suppressed, insurance premiums for tankers stay elevated, energy markets stay jumpy, and the cost eventually reaches a gas pump or a grocery store shelf somewhere far from the Persian Gulf. A technology that lets the American military more aggressively and more sustainably suppress the missile batteries, radar sites, and drone launch positions that are keeping that strait closed is not an abstract defense story. It is directly tied to how quickly or how slowly global shipping and energy markets stabilize. Before this conflict, roughly 110 ships transited the Strait of Hormuz every single day, carrying somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade. Japan draws roughly 90% of its crude oil through that exact stretch of water. South Korea, India, and China are all similarly exposed. Every additional week that traffic stays suppressed compounds insurance premiums, shipping costs, and ultimately fuel and food prices for people who will never once hear the word Valkyrie. That is the honest through line between a jet-powered drone with no pilot and the price of things thousands of miles away from where it flies. One more thing worth sitting with before we close this out. The same reporting that has tracked this program closely has also noted a detail that puts a very specific shape on how close this technology already is to being fielded in a real theater. Beyond the fighter teaming tests, the Air Force has also flown Valkyries carrying and releasing smaller drones from an internal payload bay mid-flight, effectively turning one attritable aircraft into a mothership for an even smaller layer of expendable systems underneath it. Picture that stacked all the way down. A manned fighter controlling a formation of Valkyries, each Valkyrie potentially carrying its own smaller drones to release deeper into contested airspace. That is not a single aircraft changing this war. That is an entire architecture of expendable networked systems, each layer absorbing more risk than the layer above it, with a human pilot sitting at the very top, further from the threat than at any point in the history of American air power. That architecture, fully tested in pieces, not yet assembled into a single confirmed combat deployment over Iran, is exactly why this story deserves far more attention than it has gotten. Two things before you go, and I want you to actually do them. First, if this breakdown gave you something you're not getting from the daily headline cycle, share it with one person who is trying to actually understand where this war is heading, not just what happened yesterday. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think an aircraft like this gets confirmed in an actual strike roll over Iran in the coming weeks? Or does the Pentagon keep this capability quiet for as long as possible? And bigger picture, does a drone that can make its own targeting decisions in the final seconds of a fight change? How you think about where this technology is heading, not just in this war, but in the next one? Drop your answer below. I read all of it, and if this delivered real value, hit like before you go. And if you want to see exactly how this compares to what Israel's smaller loitering munitions have already done in the same war, or how China and Russia's own attritable drone programs stack up against this one, tell me in the comments, because that is very likely the next breakdown I put together on this channel. Here is where we stand. Iran's entire strategy in this conflict, from the Mosquito fleet in the Strait of Hormuz to the mobile missile batteries scattered across its coastline, has depended on the assumption that the human cost of American air power sets a hard limit on how aggressively the power gets used. The United States has spent the last several years quietly building, testing, and refining an aircraft specifically designed to remove that limit. The Valkyrie, built by Kratos in partnership with the Air Force Research Laboratory, moved from contract to first flight in under 2.5 years, launches without a runway, has been repeatedly flight tested in coordinated formation with F-35B, F-15E, and F-16C fighters using the same tactical network already running this war, and has been trained through AI-driven simulation to fly air combat missions with no pilot aboard. It was not selected for the Air Force's next-generation collaborative combat aircraft program, but it has become the live proving ground for exactly the human-machine teaming concept that program depends on. And the manufacturer is already building airframes ahead of any confirmed large order because the demand signal is that strong. None of this means the aircraft has already flown a confirmed combat sortie over Iran. What it means is that the gap between what this drone can do and what this specific war needs has almost entirely closed, at the exact moment the conflict shows no sign of slowing down. Keep watching this one closely, because if this capability gets pulled off the shelf and into this fight, the pace of everything happening in that region is about to look very different.